Okay, let's unpack this. We are diving into something absolutely fundamental today, a phenomenon that, well, according to the stack of sources you've shared, truly touches upon everything. We're talking about bias.
Yeah, it's huge. And it's easy to think of bias just in, social terms, maybe discrimination or prejudice.
Right.
But these sources, they paint a much, much broader picture. They show bias kind of woven into the very fabric of our biology, how we think. Even feels like physics and mathematics aren't immune. It shapes our state of mind. It influences global events. And yes, it definitely impacts fundamental human needs and, consumption.
Exactly. So our mission with this deep dive is to take these sources, look at them closely, and extract the essential insights, the surprising facts, maybe the crucial connections, to help you grasp just how pervasive bias really is, and I think most importantly, why that level of pervasiveness truly matters.
So where do we start? Maybe the basics. What is bias? The sources actually offer a useful distinction here, looking at it from an AI perspective first.
Oh, interesting. How does AI see it?
Well, it's defined pretty precisely there. A systematic pattern of deviation from some kind of norm or a standard or even rationality. It's a predisposition.
Okay, systematic deviation. Makes sense for AI.
Right. And in AI, this often happens because the data it learns from is skewed to begin with, or maybe because the humans who designed it unintentionally built their own biases right into the system.
Ah, okay. So for AI, it's often about the input, the data, the code. But for us humans, the sources describe something, well, far messier, doesn't it? More complex.
Well, much more complex. It's this blend of quick mental shortcuts. Our brains use heuristics, things we pick up from society, from other people, our own unique life experiences, and maybe even predispositions that might be hardwired by evolution. It's less a technical glitch like an AI and more a fundamental aspect of, well, being human.
Yeah, that complexity really comes through. And what's striking from these sources is just how universal this is. It's not some isolated problem affecting only certain groups or places.
No, not at all. The sources really highlight it everywhere.
You see gender bias, for instance, reflected in those persistent stereotypes about who belongs in STEM versus, say, caregiving roles.
Definitely. And ageism pops up constantly. Stereotypes about older adults, but also younger adults too.
Right. And cultural bias?
Yeah.
Well, that's almost the default, isn't it? Judging everything through the lens of your own culture, sometimes assuming your way is the normal or even the superior way.
Exactly. And it's not something you just grow out of either. The sources show children exhibiting in-group preferences really early on, preferring kids who seem like them. Adolescence, hugely influenced by peer group biases, defining themselves against other groups.
Yeah.
And by adulthood, well, many biases can become quite deeply ingrained, almost automatic, really.
And looking back through history, wow, bias has been such a destructive force. The sources point again and again to examples like slavery.
Rooted in profound racial bias.
Absolutely. Or the persecution of countless minorities.
Yeah.
Driven by biases about beliefs.
Belief system biases.
Oh, and the long, long history of subjugating women due to gender bias. These weren't just, personal opinions floating around.
No, they were systemic.
Exactly. These biases were built into laws, into social structures. They've fundamentally shaped the world we inhabit today.
So, okay, that's the what and the where. But let's get into the how. How does bias actually work its way into so many different parts of life? Even things that seem objective. The sources go pretty deep here, connecting it back to our biology, our cognitive processes.
It's fascinating how they link it to potential evolutionary roots. I mean, think about that basic us versus them instinct.
Right. Survival mechanism, perhaps?
Maybe. Millennia ago, distinguishing friend from foe quickly. That could have been vital.
Yeah.
Or the fight or flight response. That's a kind of biological bias, isn't it, towards rapid threat detection?
Absolutely necessary back then, perhaps. But maybe, overly sensitive in modern social settings.
Right.
Leading us to perceive threats where none exist, just based on group affiliation.
Yeah. That makes sense. And this leads directly into cognitive biases, right? Those mental shortcuts, the heuristics our brains rely on to process information quickly.
Exactly. The sources list the classic examples. Confirmation bias.
Where you look for stuff that proves you right.
Precisely. You actively seek out information that supports what you already believe and conveniently ignore contradictory evidence. Then there's anchoring bias, getting stuck on the first piece of information you hear.
Right, letting it sway everything else.
It just disproportionately influences your judgment. Or the availability heuristic, you overestimate how likely something is, just because it comes to mind easily. Maybe it was vivid, or recent.
Yeah, like seeing a plane crash on the news and suddenly feeling flying is incredibly dangerous.
Exactly that kind of thing. These shortcuts are efficient, sure, our brains need them, but the sources really emphasize they lead to systematic, predictable errors in thinking.
And this isn't just about, personal faulty thinking. The sources show bias challenging really fundamental ideas, philosophically, for instance.
Oh yeah, it puts a huge question mark over the whole idea of objective truth, doesn't it?
It really does. If our perceptions, our ethics, our morals are all filtered through bias, can we ever truly see things as they are?
And a lot of philosophical inquiry, historically and today, is basically an attempt to identify and maybe try to transcend these filters.
And even in fields we think of as totally objective, like physics and mathematics, bias can creep in.
Subtly, yeah. The sources aren't saying, like, Universality is biased.
Right, okay.
But they point out that human bias influences which problems scientists choose to study in the first place, how they design experiments, and critically, how they interpret the data they get. Funding bias is a big one mentioned.
Okay, so what gets funded influences what gets discovered.
Exactly. It can push research towards topics that are, popular or seem profitable right now, potentially overlooking other really important areas.
And when bias gets tangled up with logic, the sources say that's a straight line to fallacies.
Yeah, logical fallacies. Think about ad hominem. Attacks, you dismiss an argument by attacking the person making it, not their ideas.
We see that all the time.
Or motivated reasoning.
Yeah.
That's where you basically twist logic and facts to arrive at a conclusion you already wanted to reach anyway. Bias just warps the rules of reasoning to serve its own ends.
Wow. And this has a profound impact on your state of mind, your well-being.
Definitely. The sources describe how a persistent negative self-bias can fuel things like anxiety and depression.
Makes sense.
And experiencing prejudice and discrimination. It's a documented cause of stress, even trauma.
Yeah.
Even something that sounds positive, like optimism bias, believing bad things are less likely to happen to you.
That can be good sometimes, right? Protective.
Can be. But it could also be risky if it makes you ignore real dangers because you think you're somehow immune.
Okay. And our belief systems, religious, political, social, the sources say they're deeply intertwined with bias.
Deeply. Tied up with identity. In-group bias, where you instinctively favor your own group and its, flip side, out-group derogation, putting down those who are different. These are incredibly common patterns described in the sources. Bias dictates how people interpret sacred texts, how they view political opponents, how they justify social structures, making them seem natural or intended.
So it shapes the very frameworks we use to understand the world.
Absolutely.
Okay, so given all that, the biology, the psychology, the philosophy, what's the real-world impact? The sources illustrate how bias affects individuals, relationships, the whole global landscape, really.
Let's start with individuals. For individuals, it affects how you see yourself, sure, but also the opportunities you're actually given.
Like in education, hiring.
Exactly. Education, hiring, career progression. Even your health and lifespan can be impacted due to systemic inequities rooted in bias. It truly shapes your life trajectory.
And between people, in relationships.
Well, bias fuels prejudice, stereotyping, discrimination. It leads to misunderstandings, conflict.
Makes connection harder.
Definitely. With everyone from family members to strangers, it just drives division.
And how does the world sort of react to this pervasive force? What do the sources say about societal responses?
It's mixed, right? The sources note societies grapple with it in different ways. Sometimes there's outright denial.
Or trying to justify the biases.
Exactly. Or, on the other hand, actively working to mitigate them. Think about civil rights movements, anti-discrimination laws, diversity and inclusion initiatives.
Right, D&I efforts.
But the sources are pretty clear. These efforts are often slow, they face significant resistance, and honestly, they're far from solving the problem entirely.
Now, here's something that really jumped out at me from the sources. Bias doesn't just cause abstract social problems. It has a tangible physical impact, even disrupting things like supply chains.
Yeah, that's a really powerful connection they make. Bias tangibly exacerbates suffering, especially during human struggles or crises.
How so?
Well, during crises, biased decisions can influence who receives aid, for example. That leads to deeply unfair, inequitable distribution of essential resources.
Wow, okay.
And think about systemic biases built into things like employment, lending, housing.
Yeah.
They create economic inequality and poverty that directly impacts who can afford and access basic goods like food and medicine.
So the supply is there, but bias affects who gets access.
Precisely. And then when group biases escalate into actual conflict that causes mass displacement, it breaks down the infrastructure needed for supply chains to even function.
Yeah.
Entire populations can be cut off from what they need to survive.
It's a stark reminder, isn't it? Bias isn't just an attitude or a thought. It has material, sometimes life-threatening consequences.
Absolutely.
The sources also get into how bias interacts with so many other aspects of the human experience you provided material on, like substance abuse.
That's mentioned. It can be, say, a harmful coping mechanism for dealing with the stress caused by experiencing bias. Or it could impair judgment, maybe leading people to act out their biases more readily when inhibitions are lowered.
And sex. I imagine that's heavily influenced.
Oh, absolutely. Deeply impacted by biases related to gender, orientation, attractiveness, social norms. You name it.
Greed. How does that connect?
Well, the sources suggest greed can be fueled by bias. If you dehumanize another group through bias, it becomes easier to justify exploiting them for your own gain.
Makes sense.
Bias also warps our perception of truth and lies. We're more likely to believe information, even false information, if it confirms our existing biases.
Right, the filter bubble effect.
Yeah, and even fundamental concepts like life and faith. The sources suggest they can either be forces that challenge our biases, or they can become frameworks that actually reinforce them. It all depends on how they're interpreted and practiced.
That's complex, and even interpreting basic emotional expressions, is that filtered by bias too?
Definitely. The sources give the example of attribution bias.
Attribution bias.
Yeah.
That's that exactly.
It's judging the same action or emotion differently, depending on whether the person is in your in-group or an out-group.
Okay. Give me an example.
Sure. An out-group member's anger might be seen as proof of their inherent aggression, right?
Okay.
Whereas an in-group member showing the same anger, oh, they're just having a bad day. See the difference?
Yeah, I do. Same behavior, totally different interpretation based on group membership.
Exactly. And the perceived purpose behind someone's actions, that's almost entirely an interpretation colored by our own biases. The sources also point out how humor is a prime example of this.
Humor? How so?
Well, what one group finds hilarious can be deeply offensive to another, can't it? Especially if the humor relies on punching down or reinforcing stereotypes about marginalized groups. It only lands if you share the underlying bias.
Right, that makes sense. Bias even shapes how we perceive our fundamental human needs, like health, food, rest.
Yeah, how we perceive them, how we prioritize them. Cultural biases, for example, can define what constitutes the good life.
Like prioritizing wealth over well-being.
Could be. Prioritizing status over community connection. Things like that.
And this influences parenting, education, relationships.
All of it. Which parenting styles are seen as right, what kind of education children receive, which relationships are valued or maybe stigmatized within a society.
In marketing, I guess they play on this constantly.
Oh, absolutely. Marketing constantly leverages our existing biases and sometimes creates new ones to drive consumption and shape what we believe we need.
It's just everywhere. Given this incredible reach, then, where does AI fit in? The sources talked about AI defining bias, but can it help us deal with it?
Well, the sources are cautiously optimistic, I'd say. They point to AI's ability to analyze just enormous amounts of data to identify existing biases.
How does it do that?
Using techniques like natural language processing, for instance. AI can detect biased language patterns in texts or speech that a human might miss.
Okay.
It can even model how biases might spread through social networks or influence collective decisions.
So AI can help us see human bias more clearly. Can it help us understand our own biases?
Potentially, yes. The sources suggest AI could maybe create awareness tools. Imagine something providing personalized feedback on your language patterns or decision-making tendencies.
Like a bias mirror?
Sort of. Or AI could power educational platforms that teach about different types of biases and how they work.
Okay. And what about using AI to build fairer systems? Is that possible?
That's perhaps the most impactful application discussed, developing and using debiasing algorithms in critical areas.
Like where?
Like hiring processes, loan applications, the justice system, even healthcare diagnostics, trying to reduce the impact of human prejudice on those really important decisions.
So the goal isn't just making people feel good about unfair systems.
No, exactly. It's using AI as a tool to try and create systems that are inherently fairer, more equitable in their outcomes.
And AI could help with logic, too, highlighting fallacies.
Yeah, pointing out where our reasoning might be flawed because we're letting our biases drive the conclusion instead of logic.
But there are limits, right? The sources caution against seeing AI as a magic bullet.
Oh, definitely. They wisely caution that AI doesn't possess, existential understanding. It doesn't have a human sense of humanity.
Right.
It can provide data, identify patterns, check logic. But truly, grappling with bias, understanding its impact, deciding on ethical action, that remains a uniquely human task.
So, thinking about all this, who actually benefits from really digging into and understanding bias?
The sources are pretty unequivocal on this. Society as a whole benefits.
Okay.
I mean, obviously, marginalized groups stand to gain enormously from reduced discrimination and having systemic barriers dismantled.
Sure.
But the sources also stress that dominant groups benefit too.
How so?
By getting a more accurate, less distorted view of the world, for one, fostering more genuine, stable relationships across different groups, living in a more just and stable society ultimately benefits everyone. Unchecked bias creates instability and limits potential for all.
And organizations, too. Businesses.
Yeah, absolutely. Better decision-making, increased innovation that comes from diverse perspectives, improved morale. The benefits are clear.
The sources also touch on a really difficult question, though. Why would someone, particularly maybe a cruel person, actively disregard the impact of bias? Why wouldn't they care?
Yeah, that's a tough one. The answer presented isn't comforting. Often, extreme biases involve the dehumanization of victims.
Making it easier to be cruel.
Exactly. Individuals who disregard bias might genuinely lack empathy. They might be driven by powerful hate ideologies, and they might sincerely believe their biased actions are justified or even necessary for their group or their belief system.
So from their point of view, it's not even bias?
Possibly not. They might not care about the concept of bias at all if it conflicts with their goals. Or they might be utterly convinced that their own biases simply represent the absolute truth. Their purpose, as the sources frame it, could be rooted in a desire for power, control, pursuing some destructive ideology, or even just a warped sense of self-preservation.
That's disturbing. What about the idea of someone being born without, say, a sense of humanity or an understanding of bias? Is that possible?
Well, the sources suggest that a sense of humanity, things like empathy, moral reasoning, isn't purely innate. It develops through a mix of our inborn capacity and crucial social learning experiences, especially during childhood.
Okay, so it's nature and nurture.
Right. And understanding bias, specifically, is presented as a more complex, higher-order cognitive skill. It builds on that foundation of empathy and social awareness.
So could development be hindered?
The sources suggest yes. Severe deprivation in early life, or maybe certain neurological conditions, could potentially hinder the development of both that basic sense of humanity and the capacity to grasp complex social concepts like bias.
Interestingly, the sources even discuss AI potentially helping people cope with the stress and trauma caused by experiencing bias. How would that work?
It's about access and tools. AI could potentially provide more accessible mental health resources and information.
Okay.
Offer stress management tools, maybe guided exercises, or even power therapy chatbots designed to help users identify negative thought patterns.
Patterns that might be rooted in internalized bias.
Exactly. Or patterns that are reactions to external prejudice they're facing, helping people recognize and maybe reframe those thoughts.
We touched on the physical aspects earlier, biology, supply chains, but the sources expand on this. What exactly is physical when dealing with bias?
It's quite literal, actually, on multiple levels.
Yep.
There's the neurobiology we talked about, the actual brain areas involved in our quick bias reactions, like the amygdala.
The fear center.
Right, and the prefrontal cortex, which is involved in trying to regulate those impulses and apply reason.
Okay, the brain hardware. What else?
Then there are the very real physiological effects of chronic stress. Experiencing discrimination day in, day out takes a physical toll. Even harboring intense anger or hatred rooted in bias can affect your body.
And the most direct physical impact.
The material consequences. The sources really highlight this. Bias results in tangible physical disparities in access to safe housing, quality healthcare, nutritious food, safety from violence, or environmental hazards.
So it affects people's physical health and well-being in very concrete, measurable ways.
Absolutely. It's not just in our heads. It shapes the physical reality of people's lives.
Looking at freedom through this lens, the sources suggest that a key part of real freedom is actually awareness of your own biases.
Yeah, awareness and critical examination. It's an interesting take on freedom, isn't it?
How so?
Well, if you're unaware of your biases, you're effectively being controlled by them, right? You're making decisions, judgments based on these invisible filters you don't even know are there.
So freedom is seeing the filters.
Seeing them, understanding them, and then choosing how to act. Choosing to act despite them or against them, rather than just being driven by them unconsciously. That's a kind of intellectual and social freedom.
And this circles right back to teaching children, doesn't it?
It really does. The sources emphasize how crucial it is to talk to kids from an early age about fairness, empathy, critical thinking, helping them identify stereotypes when they see them.
But it's hard, right? What are the obstacles?
Often the obstacles aren't the children themselves. It's us, the adults. Our own unexamined bias is getting in the way.
Or just discomfort with difficult topics.
Exactly. Discomfort may be a lack of resources or simply not knowing how to have these conversations effectively and age appropriately.
Finally, the sources mention something important about the whole experience of understanding bias. It can be, well, unsettling.
Oh, definitely. It's not always comfortable knowledge.
Once you start to really see how deep bias runs, how it affects your own thinking, how it shapes the world in ways you maybe didn't realize, it's hard to unsee it, isn't it?
Very hard. It can be uncomfortable, maybe even disillusioning at times. But the sources clearly present this awareness as an absolutely necessary first step.
It shifts your perspective.
Fundamentally, it shifts your state of mind from maybe a kind of naive acceptance of reality or naive realism to a more critical, reflective understanding of how human judgment, yours included, actually works, warts and all.
Okay. So, to try and bring this deep dive into your sources together, bias is incredibly complex. It's profoundly ingrained biologically and cognitively.
Universal across human history, cultures.
And it impacts, well, literally every area of life we've discussed today, based on these sources.
And the most crucial first step towards chipping away at its negative impacts.
Yeah.
It isn't necessarily having all the answers immediately.
Right.
It's simply understanding its pervasive nature, how it operates. And that requires both, honest human self-reflection.
Which is hard.
And, as the sources show, it can increasingly involve thoughtful AI design as a potential tool alongside that human effort.
Okay, so here's a final thought to leave everyone with, drawing from everything we've covered. Considering how bias seems so deeply wired into our biology, shaping the very way we perceive reality, influencing even our most basic needs. If you truly confront your own biases deeply, does that fundamentally change who you are? That's definitely worth spending some time with.
This is DigitView.